The sound of silverware scraping against china plates had never felt so deafening. Marcus Chen sat frozen at the mahogany dining table, his mother's words still reverberating through the candlelit room like shrapnel from an explosion. "You're nothing but a family failure, Marcus. A disappointment to everything we've built." The prime rib he'd been cutting grew cold as blood pooled around the meat, matching the crimson flush creeping up his neck. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The crystal chandelier above cast dancing shadows across his mother's face, transforming her familiar features into something almost unrecognizable. Margaret Chen, still immaculate in her emerald silk blouse, despite having spent 0 minutes in the kitchen that day, dabbed at her lips with a cloth napkin as if she'd merely commented on the weather. Around the table, the silence stretched like a taut wire ready to snap. His younger brother David's fork had stopped midway to his mouth, while his sister-in-law Jennifer stared down at her plate as if studying the floral pattern might transport her anywhere else. The irony burned in Marcus's throat more than the expensive wine his mother had insisted on serving. At 32, he was a senior software engineer at one of Seattle's most prestigious tech companies, pulling in a 6-figure salary that had single-handedly kept this very house from being sold 3 years ago. The same house where he now sat, being called a failure by the woman whose mortgage he'd been quietly paying every month since her divorce settlement ran dry. Earlier that December evening, Marcus had arrived at his childhood home in Queen Anne carrying bags filled with carefully selected gifts and a bottle of aged scotch he'd been saving for a special occasion. The Victorian house, with its wraparound porch and bay windows, had been in the Chen family for 2 generations. His grandfather had purchased it in the 1960s when the neighborhood was still affordable for middle-class families, long before tech money transformed Seattle into a playground for the wealthy. The house held memories in every corner: the kitchen where his grandmother had taught him to fold dumplings during Chinese New Year, the living room where he'd built blanket forts with David during countless rainy Seattle afternoons, the study where he'd spent high school nights hunched over calculus homework while his mother worked double shifts at the hospital to keep the family afloat after his father left. That same mother now sat across from him, her perfectly manicured nails drumming against the table's surface with practiced impatience. Margaret had always been particular about appearances, even during the lean years when she'd stretched grocery budgets and mended clothes instead of buying new ones. But somewhere between her nursing career burnout and her bitter divorce, that attention to appearance had transformed into something sharper, more demanding. The transformation had been gradual, like watching paint fade in sunlight. Small comments about his choice in clothing evolved into critiques of his career decisions. Gentle suggestions about finding a nice girl became pointed interrogations about his dating life. What had once felt like maternal concern now carried an edge that left him feeling perpetually inadequate no matter his achievements. The Christmas dinner had started pleasantly enough. David and Jennifer had driven up from Portland with their 2 young daughters, Emma and Sophie, who'd spent the afternoon playing with the vintage dollhouse that had belonged to Marcus and David when they were children. The girls' laughter had filled the house with a warmth that reminded Marcus why he'd always loved these family gatherings, despite the growing tension that seemed to follow his mother like a storm cloud. He'd volunteered to help with dinner preparations, but Margaret had waved him away with the same dismissive gesture she'd been using since he was 12. He'd passed up to ensure her financial stability. The job offers in other cities he'd declined because moving would have made it harder to help with her expenses. The social events he'd skipped to be available when she needed help with house repairs or medical appointments. The breaking point had come when Margaret had launched into a detailed comparison between Marcus and a neighbor's son who'd recently gotten engaged. "Tommy Morrison is younger than you, and he already has everything figured out. A beautiful fiancé, a house with a picket fence, 2 cars in the garage. His mother is so proud. I wish I could say the same." That last sentence had landed like a slap across the face. Marcus had set down his fork, his appetite completely gone, and had tried one last time to redirect the conversation toward something more neutral. But Margaret had sensed his discomfort like a predator sensing weakness.
"I don't understand what happened to the ambitious young man who used to live in this house," she'd continued, her voice gaining momentum. "You used to have dreams, goals, plans. Now you're just drifting through life, content to be mediocre. It's embarrassing, honestly. I don't know what to tell people when they ask about you." The words had hung in the air like poison gas, contaminating everything they touched. David had shifted uncomfortably in his chair, clearly wishing he could disappear. Jennifer had reached for her wine glass with shaking fingers. Even the children had sensed the tension, their animated chatter fading to confused whispers. Marcus had felt something fundamental shift inside his chest, like tectonic plates moving deep beneath the Earth's surface. Years of swallowed pride, buried resentment, and ignored frustration had suddenly crystallized into a moment of perfect clarity. He could see the situation exactly as it was, stripped of all the emotional camouflage that had obscured it for so long. Here he was, a successful professional who'd sacrificed his own financial goals to support his mother's lifestyle, being lectured about success by someone whose own life had fallen apart so spectacularly that she'd needed rescue. Here he was, being called mediocre by someone who hadn't worked a full-time job in 3 years. Here he was, being shamed for his choices by someone who'd made choices that had left her dependent on his generosity. The realization had been both liberating and devastating. Liberating because it finally allowed him to see the relationship clearly, without the distorting lens of guilt and obligation. Devastating because it meant accepting that his mother might never see him as anything more than a convenient source of financial support and emotional frustration. Margaret had continued her monologue, seemingly oblivious to the earthquake she'd triggered. "I just don't understand how I raised such a family failure. David turned out perfectly fine. He has goals, ambition, a real life. But you..." She gestured at him dismissively, as if he were a piece of furniture that had disappointed him with its quality. The phrase, family failure, had echoed in the sudden silence that followed, bouncing off the walls of the dining room like a ricocheting bullet. Marcus had felt his face flush hot with shame and anger, but beneath those familiar emotions lay something new and unexpected. Relief. Relief that the pretense was finally over. Relief that he no longer had to pretend this relationship was healthy or sustainable. Relief that the truth had finally been spoken, even if it wasn't the truth he would have chosen. David had finally found his voice, his face pale with shock. "Mom, that's completely unfair. Marcus has been incredibly generous to this family. Without him..." But Margaret had cut him off with a sharp look that could have frozen water. "Don't defend his mediocrity, David. Just because he throws money at problems doesn't mean he's successful. Success is about building something meaningful, creating a legacy, contributing to society, not just collecting paychecks and living alone in an apartment like some kind of hermit." The accusation of hermit-like existence, particularly rich coming from someone who'd spent the past year becoming increasingly isolated, driving away friends with her negative attitude and demanding behavior. But Marcus had long since stopped expecting logical consistency from his mother's criticisms. Jennifer had attempted to lighten the mood by complimenting the meal and asking about dessert, but her efforts had fallen flat against the wall of tension that now dominated the room. The children had begun to fidget in their chairs, sensing the adult conflict but unable to understand its source. Emma, the older of David's daughters, had asked in a small voice if Uncle Marcus was in trouble, her question carrying the kind of innocent concern that made the adult behavior seem even more shameful. Marcus had looked around the table at his family, these people who were supposed to love and support him unconditionally, and had seen something that broke his heart. David's sympathetic but helpless expression, Jennifer's obvious discomfort and desire to escape, his mother's satisfied smirk as if she'd finally succeeded in putting him in his place. The children's confused faces as they tried to navigate the emotional minefield that their Christmas dinner had become. In that moment, Marcus had realized that this wasn't just about one harsh comment or one difficult evening. This was about a pattern of behavior that had been escalating for years, a dynamic that had become toxic and unsustainable. This was about a relationship that had become so imbalanced that even his considerable financial support couldn't buy him basic respect or appreciation. The weight of this realization had settled on his shoulders like a heavy coat. For years, he'd been telling himself that his mother's behavior was temporary, a phase she'd work through once she'd fully processed her divorce and found her emotional footing. He'd made excuses for her sharp comments and unreasonable demands, attributing them to stress or grief or adjustment difficulties. But sitting there, in the dining room where he'd eaten thousands of meals over the course of his lifetime, Marcus had finally admitted to himself that this wasn't a phase. This was who his mother had become, or perhaps who she'd always been beneath the surface. The woman who'd once stayed up all night nursing him through childhood fevers had transformed into someone who could call him a family failure without apparent remorse or self-awareness. The grandfather clock in the corner had chimed 8 o'clock, its melodic tones a sharp contrast to the discord filling the room. Margaret had used the sound as a cue to rise from her chair, smoothing her silk blouse with practiced movements. "I think we should clear the table and move to the living room for dessert," she'd announced, her tone suggesting that the previous conversation had been nothing more than casual dinner chat. But Marcus had remained seated, his hands folded in his lap, his mind racing through calculations that had nothing to do with his job in software development. He'd been calculating the cost of his generosity over the past 3 years. The mortgage payments, the utility bills, the property taxes, the insurance premiums, the maintenance expenses, the emergency repairs. The total had been staggering, representing a significant portion of his income and virtually all of his potential savings. More than that, he'd been calculating the emotional cost, the stress of managing his mother's expectations alongside his own career responsibilities, the guilt he'd felt whenever he'd prioritized his own needs over her demands, the loneliness of relationships that had withered because he'd always been too financially and emotionally tied up in family obligations to invest properly in them. The sound of chairs scraping against the hardwood floor had pulled him back to the present moment. David and Jennifer were gathering plates and glasses, their movements careful and quiet, as if too much noise might shatter something irreparable. Margaret had disappeared into the kitchen, her heels clicking against the tiles with their characteristic staccato rhythm. Marcus had remained at the table, staring.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
The abandoned mass of his Christmas dinner. The prime rib had congealed in its own juices, the mashed potatoes had formed a skin on their surface, and the green beans had lost their vibrant color. It had struck him as a perfect metaphor for the evening itself, something that had started with promise and potential, only to grow cold and unappetizing through neglect and carelessness. When David had returned from the kitchen, his expression had been carefully neutral, but Marcus had known his brother well enough to recognize the concern in his eyes. David had always been the peacemaker in the family, the one who smoothed over conflicts and found compromises when tensions ran high. But even David's diplomatic skills had seemed inadequate for the current situation. "She didn't mean it," David had said quietly, his voice barely audible over the sound of running water from the kitchen. "You know how she gets when she's stressed. The holidays always make her emotional." But Marcus had shaken his head, finally understanding something that had eluded him for years. "She did mean it, David. That's the problem. She meant every word." The conversation had been interrupted by the sound of the front doorbell, its chimes cutting through the tension like a knife through fabric. Margaret's voice had carried from the kitchen, sharp with annoyance. "Who could that be at this time of night? We're not expecting anyone." David had moved toward the front door, but Marcus had stood up first, grateful for any excuse to escape the suffocating atmosphere of the dining room. He'd walked through the living room, past the Christmas tree that he'd helped decorate just 2 days earlier, past the family photos that documented decades of holidays and celebrations, past the fireplace where stockings hung with their names embroidered in his grandmother's careful script. Through the frosted glass panels of the front door, Marcus had been able to make out the silhouette of a tall figure and what appeared to be a military uniform.
The sight had puzzled him, since nobody in their immediate family had current military connections. But when he'd opened the door, he'd found himself face to face with someone who would change the trajectory of his entire evening. Colonel James Patterson stood on the porch, his dress uniform impeccable despite the December cold, his posture straight as a steel rod, his eyes sharp and intelligent beneath bushy gray eyebrows. He appeared to be in his late 50s, with the kind of weathered face that spoke of decades spent outdoors in challenging conditions. In his hands, he held a small wrapped package and an expression of polite uncertainty. "I'm sorry to bother you on Christmas evening," the colonel had said, his voice carrying the crisp authority of someone accustomed to being heard and obeyed. "I'm looking for the Chen residence. I believe Mrs. Margaret Chen lives here." Marcus had nodded, stepping back to allow the cold air to remind him that there was a world beyond the other-heated drama of the dining room. "That's my mother. I'm Marcus Chen. Can I help you?" The colonel had extended his hand in a firm shake that conveyed both strength and respect. "Colonel James Patterson, retired. I served with your grandfather in Vietnam many years ago. I was in the area visiting family and thought I'd stop by to pay my respects. Your grandfather saved my life during the Tet Offensive in 1968. I've never forgotten that debt." The mention of his grandfather had sent a jolt of surprise through Marcus. Thomas Chen had died when Marcus was 15, but he'd left behind stories that had shaped Marcus's understanding of courage and sacrifice. His grandfather had rarely spoken about his military service, but the few stories he'd shared had painted pictures of extraordinary bravery and selflessness under the most difficult circumstances imaginable. "Please come in," Marcus had said, stepping aside to allow the colonel to enter. "I know my mother would want to meet you. We're just finishing Christmas dinner." As they'd walked toward the dining room, Marcus had caught fragments
Conversation from the kitchen where Margaret was apparently lecturing Jennifer about proper dishwashing techniques. Her voice had carried the same critical tone she'd used during dinner, and Marcus had felt a familiar tightness in his chest. But the colonel's presence had somehow shifted the energy in the house, introducing an element of gravity and respect that had been sorely lacking. When they'd entered the dining room, Margaret had looked up from the sideboard, where she'd been arranging dessert plates, her expression shifting from annoyance to curiosity to something approaching delight when she'd taken in the colonel's impressive appearance. She'd always been drawn to authority figures and impressive credentials, and a retired military officer was exactly the kind of person she enjoyed entertaining. "Mother," Marcus had said, his voice carrying more formality than usual. "This is Colonel James Patterson. He served with grandfather in Vietnam." The transformation in Margaret's demeanor had been instantaneous and remarkable. Her spine had straightened, her smile had become genuine rather than practiced, and her voice had taken on a warmth that Marcus hadn't heard directed at him in years. "Colonel Patterson, what an honor. Please sit down. Can I get you some coffee? Dessert? We have homemade apple pie." The colonel had accepted the offer graciously, taking the seat that Marcus had recently vacated at the dining table. His presence had seemed to fill the room with a different kind of energy, something solid and reassuring that pushed back against the toxic atmosphere that had dominated the evening. David and Jennifer had returned from the kitchen, their curiosity evident as they'd taken in the unexpected guest. "I hope I'm not intruding on your family celebration," Colonel Patterson had said, as Margaret had bustled around serving pie and coffee. "But when I realized I was so close to Thomas Chen's family, I couldn't pass up the opportunity to pay my respects. Your father was an extraordinary man, Mrs. Chen. His courage and leadership saved countless lives, including mine." Margaret had practically glowed under the praise, basking in reflected glory from her deceased father-in-law's military service. It had been a side of her that Marcus hadn't seen in years, the warm and gracious hostess who'd once made everyone feel welcome in their home. For a moment, he'd glimpsed the woman she'd been before bitterness and disappointment had hardened her heart. The colonel had launched into stories about Thomas Chen's service in Vietnam, painting vivid pictures of a young soldier who displayed remarkable courage under fire and an unwavering commitment to protecting his fellow servicemen.
He described specific incidents where Thomas's quick thinking and decisive action had prevented disasters, moments of heroism that had never made it into the family stories Marcus had grown up hearing. "Your grandfather had a saying," Colonel Patterson had continued, his voice taking on the respectful tone of someone sharing sacred wisdom. "He used to tell us that a man's true measure isn't found in what he accumulates for himself, but in what he's willing to sacrifice for others. He lived that philosophy every single day we served together." The words had hit Marcus like a lightning bolt, illuminating something that had been hidden in shadows for far too long. Here was his grandfather's philosophy, articulated by someone who'd witnessed it in action under the most extreme circumstances imaginable. Here was a definition of success that had nothing to do with marriage status or property ownership or social appearances, and everything to do with character and sacrifice and service to others. Margaret had continued to beam with pride, clearly enjoying the reflected glory of her connection to such a heroic figure. But as the Colonel's stories had continued, something subtle had begun to shift in the room's dynamic. The contrast between Thomas Chen's selfless service and the evening's earlier conversation had become increasingly stark and uncomfortable. "I remember
Incident in particular," the colonel had said, his voice growing more serious. "We were pinned down by enemy fire, and several of our men were wounded and unable to move. Thomas could have stayed in cover, waited for backup, played it safe. Instead, he risked his own life repeatedly to drag each wounded soldier to safety. When someone asked him why he'd taken such risks, he said something I've never forgotten." The colonel had paused to take a sip of coffee, clearly savoring both the beverage and the memory. The dining room had grown completely quiet, with even the children sensing that they were hearing something important and sacred. He said that family isn't just about blood relations. Family is about the people you're willing to sacrifice for, the people whose welfare matters more to you than your own comfort or safety. He said that a man who won't sacrifice for his family isn't a man at all, but someone who sacrifices everything for his family without appreciation or recognition is the highest form of honor. The silence that had followed these words had been deafening. Marcus had felt as if the colonel had reached directly into his chest and spoken to something deep in his soul, giving voice to feelings and experiences that he'd never been able to articulate. Here was validation from a source that even his mother couldn't dismiss or minimize, a respected military officer who'd known and served with the family patriarch. Margaret's expression had begun to change as the implications of the colonel's words had settled in. Her smile had faded slightly, replaced by something more thoughtful and uncertain. For perhaps the first time in years, she'd seemed to be genuinely listening, rather than simply waiting for her turn to speak. The colonel had continued, seemingly unaware of the emotional earthquake he was triggering. "Thomas used to carry letters from all of us, ready to mail them to our families if something happened to us. But I'll never forget what he said about his own family. He said his greatest hope was that his children and grandchildren would understand the difference between being served and serving others. He worried that prosperity might make them forget the value of sacrifice." These words had landed like artillery shells in the quiet dining room, each sentence exploding with implications that couldn't be ignored or dismissed. Margaret had gone very still, her coffee cup frozen halfway to her lips, as if she'd suddenly realized that the conversation had taken a turn she hadn't anticipated. David had glanced between Marcus and their mother, his expression showing that he was beginning to understand the broader context of what they were hearing. Jennifer had reached for his hand under the table, her intuition apparently warning her that they were witnessing something significant and potentially uncomfortable. But Colonel Patterson had continued his recollections, apparently oblivious to the family dynamics he was inadvertently exposing. "Your grandfather talked about his family constantly. He was so proud of his son. That would be your late husband, Mrs. Chen. And he had such high hopes for his future grandchildren. He used to say that he was fighting not just for his country, but for the kind of world where his grandchildren could grow up with opportunities he'd never had. The colonel had turned his attention directly to Marcus then, his sharp eyes studying the younger man with the same intensity he'd probably once used to evaluate soldiers under his command. Thomas would have been incredibly proud of you, son. From what I understand, you've built a successful career in technology, and you've stepped up to support your family when they needed you. That's exactly the kind of character he hoped his legacy would produce. The praise had hit Marcus like a physical force, partly because it came from such an unexpected source, but mostly because it represented the kind of recognition and validation that had been absent from his life for too long. Here was someone who understood sacrifice and service, someone who could recognize the value of what he'd been doing for his family.
Even if his family couldn't see it themselves, Margaret had finally found her voice, but it had come out smaller and less certain than usual. Colonel Patterson, you're very kind, but I'm afraid Marcus hasn't quite lived up to his potential. He's still unmarried, living alone, no children. I worry that he's wasting his opportunities. The colonel had set down his coffee cup with a deliberate motion that suggested he was choosing his words carefully. When he'd spoken, his voice had carried the quiet authority of someone who'd seen enough of life to understand what really mattered and what didn't. Mrs. Chen, with all due respect, I think you might be measuring success by the wrong standards. In my experience, a man who sacrifices his own comfort to ensure his family's security and well-being is demonstrating the highest form of success possible. Marriage and children are blessings, certainly, but they're not the only measures of a life well lived. The rebuke had been gentle, but unmistakable, delivered with the kind of quiet dignity that made arguing with it seem petty and small. Margaret had opened her mouth as if to respond, then had closed it again, apparently recognizing that challenging a decorated veteran's perspective on character and sacrifice would make her look foolish. The colonel had felt something fundamental shift inside his chest, as if puzzle pieces that had been scattered for years were suddenly clicking into place. Here was external validation of what he'd been feeling but couldn't articulate, that his choices had value, that his sacrifices had meaning, that his definition of family loyalty was not only valid but admirable. The colonel had continued, his voice growing warmer as he'd expanded on his theme. Your grandfather understood that true strength often looks like weakness to people who don't understand sacrifice. The soldier who shares his rations with hungry civilians might look foolish to someone who's never been hungry. The son who delays his own dreams to support his family might look unsuccessful to someone who's never had to choose between personal ambition and family loyalty. Each word had felt like a balm on wounds that Marcus hadn't even realized were still bleeding. For the first time in years, he'd felt truly seen and understood by someone whose opinion carried weight and authority. The colonel's perspective had reframed his entire situation, transforming what had felt like personal failure into something that looked remarkably like honor and integrity. Margaret had remained unusually quiet throughout this exchange, her usual quick responses and defensive justifications notably absent. She'd seemed to be processing something complex and uncomfortable. Her brought something that belonged to your grandfather, he'd said, placing it gently on the table in front of Marcus. It's a compass he carried throughout his service in Vietnam. He gave it to me during our last week in country. Said he wanted me to have something to remember him by. Marcus had unwrapped the package with trembling fingers, revealing a military compass in a worn brass case. The metal had been polished smooth by decades of handling, and small scratches on its surface had told stories of hard use under difficult conditions. Inside the case, an inscription had been etched in Thomas Chen's careful handwriting. True north is always toward honor. He told me that compass had never led him astray, not once during all our time in the jungle.
But he said, the real compass a man needs isn't made of brass and magnetism. It's made of character and principle. He said, as long as a man keeps his moral compass pointed toward honor and service, he'll never truly be lost. The symbolism had been overwhelming in its perfection. Here was his grandfather's compass, both literal and metaphorical, being passed down through an unexpected messenger who'd arrived exactly the moment when Marcus had needed guidance most desperately. The timing had felt almost supernatural, as if Thomas Chen's spirit had somehow arranged this encounter to provide direction when his grandson was most lost. Margaret had stared at the compass with an expression that Marcus couldn't quite read. Something in her face had suggested that she was remembering things she'd forgotten, perhaps recalling conversations with her father-in-law about values and priorities that she'd let slip away over the years. Your grandfather worried about prosperity, the colonel had said, his voice taking on a more serious tone. He'd seen how comfortable circumstances could make people forget the importance of sacrifice and service. He used to say that the greatest danger facing America wasn't foreign enemies, but the possibility that future generations would become so comfortable that they'd forget what their freedom had cost. These words had hung in the air like an indictment, their implications impossible to ignore or rationalize away. Margaret had shifted uncomfortably in her chair, perhaps beginning to recognize how far she'd drifted from the values that had once defined her family. The colonel had stood up then, his movement decisive and final. "I should let you return to your family celebration," he'd said, but his eyes had remained fixed on Margaret with an intensity that suggested his words were meant specifically for her. "Mrs. Chen, your father-in-law would have been proud of the son you've raised. Marcus embodies everything Thomas hoped his legacy would represent: strength, sacrifice, loyalty, and honor." The validation had been complete and unambiguous, delivered by someone whose authority and credibility were unquestionable. Margaret had had no choice but to accept the assessment, even if it contradicted everything she'd been saying about her son for the past several years. As they'd walked the colonel to the door, Marcus had felt as if he were moving through a dream. The compass had remained clutched in his hand, its weight both comforting and significant. At the threshold, Colonel Patterson had turned back one final time, his expression grave and purposeful. "Son," he'd said, placing a firm hand on Marcus's shoulder, "your grandfather once told me that a man's first duty is to his family, but his second duty is to himself. Sometimes those duties conflict, and when they do, a man has to make difficult choices. Your grandfather would understand whatever choice you make as long as it's made with honor." The words had felt like permission, like absolution, like a blessing all rolled into one. Here was Thomas Chen's comrade telling Marcus that self-preservation could be honorable, that walking away from toxicity could be an act of courage rather than abandonment. After the colonel had left, the house had felt different, as if the very air had been changed by his presence. Margaret had returned to the dining room and had begun clearing the remaining dishes with unusual quietness, her normal commentary and criticism notably absent. David and Jennifer had taken the children upstairs to get ready for bed, leaving Marcus alone with his thoughts and his grandfather's compass. The contrast between the evening's two halves had been jarring. The first half had been filled with criticism and disappointment, culminating in his mother's devastating assessment of him as a family failure. The second half had brought validation and recognition from someone who'd known and served with the family patriarch, someone whose judgment carried the weight of shared sacrifice and military honor. Marcus had stood in the dining room, surrounded by the remnants of Christmas dinner, trying to process the emotional whiplash of the evening.
In the space of a few hours, he'd been torn down and built back up, destroyed and redeemed, dismissed and honored. The compass in his hand had felt like an anchor in a storm, a tangible reminder that perspective could change everything. When Margaret had returned from the kitchen, her usual commanding presence had seemed diminished somehow.
Colonel's words had deflated something inside her. She'd moved around the room mechanically, blowing out candles and folding napkins, avoiding eye contact with her son. Finally, she'd broken the silence, her voice smaller and less certain than Marcus had heard it in years. "The Colonel seems like a very nice man," she'd said, the words carrying an undertone of something that might have been apology, though not quite. Marcus had nodded, still holding the compass, still processing everything that had happened. "He is, and he knew grandfather well. It means a lot to hear those stories." Margaret had paused in her tidying, her hands stilling on a water glass. "I suppose your grandfather would have been proud of you," she'd said, the admission seeming to cost her something. The statement had been as close to an apology as Marcus was likely to get, and he'd recognized it as such. But something fundamental had shifted during the Colonel's visit, something that couldn't be undone by half-hearted acknowledgments or backhanded compliments. For the first time in his adult life, Marcus had seen himself clearly through eyes that weren't clouded by family dynamics and emotional manipulation. He'd seen himself as his grandfather might have seen him, as a man of honor and sacrifice, someone worthy of respect and admiration. That vision of himself had been so different from the one his mother had been painting that it had felt like looking at a completely different person. The compass in his hand had seemed to pulse with significance, its needle pointing steadily north despite the emotional chaos of the evening. "True north is always toward honor," his grandfather had written. And Marcus had finally understood what that meant. Honor wasn't about meeting other people's expectations or conforming to their definitions of success. Honor was about staying true to your own principles, even when it was difficult or costly. As he'd prepared to leave that night, gathering his coat and keys while his family settled into their post-dinner routines, Marcus had felt as if he were standing at a crossroads. The path he'd been following, the one that led through endless sacrifice without recognition or appreciation, stretched out behind him like a well-worn trail. But ahead lay something different, something that the Colonel's words had illuminated like a lighthouse cutting through fog. The drive back to his Capitol Hill apartment had been quiet, the Seattle streets unusually empty for Christmas night. Marcus had gripped the steering wheel with one hand and his grandfather's compass with the other, the cool brass warming under his palm. The city's familiar landmarks had seemed different somehow, as if he were seeing them through new eyes. The Space Needle piercing the cloudy sky, the waterfront stretching toward Elliott Bay, the hill neighborhoods climbing toward the stars. All of it had looked the same, but his perspective on his place within it had fundamentally shifted. His apartment building, a converted warehouse with exposed brick walls and high ceilings, had felt like a sanctuary when he'd finally climbed the 3 flights of stairs to his door. The space was modest but comfortable, decorated with minimalist furniture and carefully chosen artwork that reflected his personality rather than anyone else's expectations. For the first time in months, he'd looked around his home and had seen success rather than inadequacy. The living room held a comfortable reading chair positioned near tall windows that offered views of the city skyline. His bookshelf contained a mixture of technical manuals and classic literature, evidence of a mind that valued both practical knowledge and cultural enrichment. The kitchen, though small, was equipped with high-quality appliances that reflected his love of cooking, a hobby he'd developed after moving out of his mother's house and discovering the pleasure of creating meals without criticism or interference. Marcus had set the compass on his kitchen counter and had made himself a cup of tea, a ritual that usually helped him process complex emotions. But tonight, even this familiar routine had felt different. Steam rising from his mug had seemed to carry with it the weight of evening's revelations, each sip bringing new clarity about his situation and his choices. The apartment's quiet had been a stark contrast to the tension-filled atmosphere he'd left behind in Queen Anne. Here, there were no critical comments waiting around every corner, no passive-aggressive observations about his life choices, no constant measurements against other people's achievements. Here, there was only peace and the space to think clearly about what he wanted his future to look like. He'd taken the compass to his desk,
a sleek piece of furniture positioned near the window where he often worked on personal projects in the evenings. Under the light of his desk lamp, the brass had gleamed with a warm patina that spoke of decades of faithful service. The inscription, "True North is always toward honor," had seemed to glow with significance, as if his grandfather were speaking directly to him across the years. Marcus had opened his laptop and had begun composing an email, not to his mother, but to his friend Kevin, a fellow software engineer who'd been encouraging him to consider job opportunities in other cities. For months, Marcus had dismissed these suggestions, bound by what he'd believed were family obligations. But the colonel's words about duty to oneself had opened up possibilities that had previously seemed unthinkable. The email had been brief and to the point. "Kevin, remember that position you mentioned in Austin? The one with the startup that's revolutionizing cloud infrastructure? If it's still available, I'd like to learn more about it. I think it might be time for a change of scenery." Sending the email had felt like taking the first step on a new path, one that led toward his own definition of success, rather than someone else's. The immediate response from Kevin, despite the late hour and holiday timing, had been enthusiastic and encouraging. The position was indeed still available, the company was impressive, and the salary was significantly higher than his current compensation. Over the following days, between Christmas and New Year's Eve, Marcus had found himself engaging in a series of conversations that gradually built toward a major life change. Phone interviews with executives at the Austin startup had gone exceptionally well, revealing opportunities for growth and leadership that far exceeded anything available in his current position. The company's culture emphasized innovation and individual contribution, values that aligned perfectly with his professional goals. But more importantly, Marcus had begun having difficult conversations with himself about his relationship with his mother, particularly his mother. The compass had remained on his desk throughout this period, a constant reminder of his grandfather's values and the colonel's validation. Each time he'd been tempted to fall back into old patterns of guilt and obligation, he'd looked at that brass instrument and had remembered that honor sometimes required difficult choices. David had called several times during that week, ostensibly to check on Marcus's well-being, but clearly also to gauge the fallout from Christmas dinner. These conversations had been awkward and painful, filled with the kind of careful diplomacy that indicated everyone involved knew that something fundamental had shifted. "Mom's been quiet since you left," David had reported during one of these calls. "I think the colonel's visit really affected her. She keeps asking questions about grandfather's military service, stuff she's never shown interest in before." Marcus had listened to these updates with a mixture of hope and skepticism. Part of him had wanted to believe that his mother was genuinely reflecting on her behavior and might be capable of meaningful change. But a larger part of him had recognized that temporary guilt was different from permanent transformation, and that expecting lasting change from someone who'd shown little capacity for self-reflection was likely to lead only to further disappointment. The job offer from Austin had arrived on December 30th, delivered via
email in the form of a comprehensive package that exceeded Marcus's expectations in every category. The salary increase was substantial, the benefits were excellent, and the stock options suggested significant potential for long-term wealth building. More importantly, the role represented a genuine advancement in his career, the kind of opportunity that could define his professional trajectory for years to come. But accepting the offer would mean leaving Seattle, leaving his family, leaving the safety net he'd been providing for his mother. It would mean choosing his own future over his obligations to someone who'd made it clear that his sacrifices weren't valued or appreciated. It would mean taking the colonel's advice about duty to oneself and putting it into practice in the most dramatic way possible. Marcus had printed out the offer letter and had placed it next to his grandfather's compass on the desk, studying both documents as if they were pieces of a puzzle that needed to be solved together. The compass needle had pointed steadily north, unwavering in its direction, while the job offer had pointed toward a future that was both exciting and terrifying in its possibilities. The decision had crystallized on New Year's Eve, when Margaret had called him for the first time since Christmas dinner. Her voice had carried a false brightness that had immediately put Marcus on guard, and her opening pleasantries had felt rehearsed and insincere. "I was thinking we should have dinner soon," she'd said after several minutes of awkward small talk. "Maybe next weekend? I could make that pasta dish you used to love when you were little." The attempt at maternal warmth had felt manipulative rather than genuine, particularly coming so soon after her brutal assessment of his life choices. Marcus had recognized the pattern: criticism followed by brief periods of superficial kindness designed to maintain his emotional and financial investment in the relationship. "I'm not sure that's a good idea, Mom," he'd said, his voice steady despite the hammering of his heart. "I think we need some time apart to process what happened at Christmas." The silence that had followed had been deafening, filled with the kind of charged tension that preceded either explosion or capitulation. When Margaret had finally spoken, her voice had carried the sharp edge that Marcus knew preceded her most cutting observations. "I suppose you're going to punish me now," she'd said, the words dripping with victimhood and self-pity. "Hold one difficult conversation over my head forever. I thought you were more mature than that." The accusation had been so perfectly calibrated to trigger guilt and self-doubt that Marcus had almost fallen for it, almost allowed himself to be drawn back into the familiar dance of appeasement and accommodation. But the compass on his desk had caught the light from his window, its brass surface gleaming like a reminder of higher principles and clearer thinking. "Mom," he'd said, his voice carrying a firmness that surprised even him, "you called me a family failure at Christmas dinner, in front of everyone, after years of me supporting you financially and emotionally. This isn't about punishment or immaturity. This is about recognizing when a relationship has become too toxic to continue." The word toxic had hung in the air between them like a judgment that couldn't be appealed or overturned. Margaret had gasped audibly, as if he'd physically struck her. But Marcus had pressed on, determined to say what needed to be said. "I've spent 3 years sacrificing my own goals to make sure you were comfortable and secure. I've never asked for gratitude or recognition, but I also didn't expect to be called a failure for my efforts. The Colonel helped me understand something important. Honor isn't about enduring abuse. It's about standing up for what's right." Margaret's response had been swift and vicious, confirming everything Marcus had suspected about her capacity for genuine remorse or self-reflection. "How dare you call me abusive? After everything I've done for you, everything I've sacrificed, you're just like your father."
Selfish, ungrateful, always ready to abandon family when things get difficult. The comparison to his father, a man who'd indeed abandoned the family during Marcus's teenage years, had been designed to cut deep and cause maximum emotional damage. But instead of triggering the expected guilt and retreat, it had only strengthened Marcus's resolve. If his mother was willing to use such weapons in what should have been a conversation about healing their relationship, then the relationship was indeed beyond repair. "I'm taking a job in Austin," he'd said, the words emerging with a clarity and finality that surprised him. "I'll be moving in 6 weeks. I wanted you to hear it from me directly." The announcement had been met with a stunned silence that had stretched so long Marcus had wondered if the call had been disconnected. When Margaret had finally spoken, her voice had been small and shocked, as if she genuinely never considered the possibility that her behavior might have consequences. "You're leaving? You're actually leaving Seattle?" "Yes," Marcus had confirmed, feeling a strange sense of peace settle over him. "It's a significant career advancement, and it's time for me to start living my own life." What had followed had been a desperate attempt at manipulation so transparent that it had almost been comical. Promises of change, threats of abandonment, appeals to family loyalty, predictions of future regret. Margaret had cycled through every emotional weapon in her arsenal, seeking something that might change his mind or at least delay his departure. But Marcus had remained unmoved, anchored by the compass on his desk and the clarity that had come from finally seeing his situation through objective eyes. Each of her arguments had only confirmed that he was making the right choice, that staying would mean accepting a lifetime of emotional manipulation and financial exploitation. The conversation had ended badly, with Margaret hanging up after a final burst of accusations and recriminations. But instead of feeling devastated or guilty, Marcus had felt lighter, as if a weight he'd been carrying for years had finally been lifted from his shoulders. Over the following weeks, as he'd prepared for his move to Austin, Marcus had been struck by how many people in his life had been supportive of his decision. Colleagues had congratulated him on the career advancement, friends had expressed excitement about visiting him in Texas, even his neighbors had wished him well and had offered to help with the logistics of moving. The only resistance had come from his immediate family, and even there, the response had been mixed. David had been conflicted, understanding Marcus's reasoning while worrying about the impact on their mother. Jennifer had been quietly supportive, having witnessed Margaret's behavior firsthand and understanding its toxicity. The children had been sad to see their uncle moving away, but had been excited by the prospect of visiting Austin and seeing the state capitol. Margaret herself had oscillated between rage and pleading, sending emails and text messages that ranged from furious accusations to desperate bargaining attempts. She'd promised to change her behavior, offered to seek counseling, even suggested that they could start fresh with clearly defined boundaries. But Marcus had recognized these offers as temporary concessions designed to prevent his departure rather than genuine commitments to lasting change. The most telling moment had come when Margaret had tried to enlist other family members in her campaign to convince Marcus to stay. Her version of events, as reported back to him by various relatives, had been so distorted and self-serving that it had confirmed his assessment of her character. According to Margaret's narrative, Marcus was abandoning her in her time of need, choosing career advancement over family loyalty, and breaking promises he never actually made. But the Colonel's visit had left its mark on the broader family understanding of the situation. Several relatives who might have otherwise accepted Margaret's version of events had asked more probing questions,
Remembered their own experiences with her difficult behavior, and had ultimately declined to pressure Marcus into staying. The validation from Thomas Chen's military comrade had carried weight that even Margaret's manipulations couldn't overcome. As moving day had approached, Marcus had felt increasingly confident that he was making the right choice. The startup in Austin had continued to impress him with their professionalism and vision. His new apartment, located in a trendy neighborhood known for its music scene and food culture, promised a lifestyle that was both professionally rewarding and personally fulfilling. Most importantly, he'd begun to envision a future where his choices were his own, where his success was measured by his own standards rather than someone else's expectations, where his relationships were based on mutual respect and genuine affection, rather than financial dependency and emotional manipulation. The compass had remained on his desk throughout this period, packed only at the very last moment before the movers arrived. Its steady presence had served as a constant reminder that he was following his own true north, making decisions based on honor and self-respect rather than fear and obligation. On his final night in Seattle, Marcus had stood at his apartment window looking out at the city skyline he'd called home for his entire life. The lights had twinkled in the distance like stars, beautiful and familiar, but no longer confining. Tomorrow would bring new landscapes, new opportunities, and new relationships built on healthier foundations. The phone had rung one last time, Margaret's number appearing on the screen with an urgency that suggested this might be her final attempt to change his mind. Marcus had stared at the phone for several rings, considering whether to answer, whether there was any possibility that this conversation might be different from all the others. In the end, he'd let it go to voicemail, choosing silence over conflict, departure over endless negotiation. The message she'd left had been predictably manipulative, a mixture of guilt and threat designed to trigger last-minute doubt. But Marcus had deleted it without fully listening, unwilling to let her voice contaminate his final hours in Seattle. Instead, he'd picked up his grandfather's compass one last time, feeling its familiar weight in his palm. The needle had pointed steadily north, just as it had for decades, unwavering in its direction despite the chaos and uncertainty that had surrounded it. True north is always toward honor, Thomas Chen had written, and Marcus had finally learned to trust that guidance above all other voices. The Austin skyline gleamed under the Texas sun as Marcus stepped out of the rideshare vehicle that had brought him from the airport to his new neighborhood. The heat hit him immediately, a dry warmth that felt nothing like Seattle's perpetual dampness. East Austin stretched before him, a vibrant tapestry of converted warehouses, trendy cafes, and murals that painted stories across brick walls. The contrast with his former home couldn't have been more pronounced, and for the first time in months, Marcus felt his shoulders relax. His new apartment occupied the second floor of a renovated building that had once housed a textile factory. The exposed brick walls and industrial fixtures gave the space character that his sterile Seattle apartment had never possessed. Floor-to-ceiling windows flooded the rooms with natural light, and a small balcony offered views of the downtown district where he'd be working. The moving truck had arrived that morning, and boxes labeled in his careful handwriting waited to be unpacked, each one representing a piece of his old life being transported into something entirely new. Marcus had spent the first week settling into routines that felt foreign and liberating. His morning run took him through neighborhoods where food trucks served breakfast tacos to construction workers and musicians carried guitar cases to early practice sessions. The coffee shop 3 blocks from his apartment became his regular stop, where baristas with tattoos and silver rings served coffee and lattes with the ambiance of a speakeasy.
Sleeve tattoos and infectious enthusiasm made drinks that put Seattle's famous coffee culture to shame. Everything felt different, from the cadence of conversations he overheard to the music that drifted from open windows. The startup offices occupied a sleek building in the downtown core, all glass and steel reaching toward cloudless skies. Meridian Technologies had been founded by 3 former Google engineers who'd grown tired of corporate bureaucracy and wanted to revolutionize how businesses managed their cloud infrastructure. The company culture was everything Marcus had hoped for: collaborative without being suffocating, innovative without being chaotic, ambitious without being cutthroat. His new colleagues were impressive without being intimidating. Sarah Martinez, the lead architect, had spent 5 years at Amazon before deciding she wanted to build something from the ground up. James Thompson, the head of security, was a former military communications specialist who understood both the technical and human elements of protecting digital assets. Lisa Park, who managed client relationships, had an MBA from Wharton and a gift for translating complex technical concepts into language that business executives could understand and appreciate. The work itself was challenging in ways that Marcus hadn't experienced in years. Instead of maintaining existing systems and implementing incremental improvements, he was helping to design revolutionary approaches to data management and server optimization. His suggestions were not only welcomed, but actively solicited, and his insights were treated as valuable contributions rather than unwelcome complications. Within 2 weeks, Marcus had been assigned to lead a team of junior developers working on what would become Meridian's flagship product. The responsibility was both exhilarating and terrifying, representing the kind of career advancement that would have taken years to achieve in his previous position. But more importantly, it represented recognition of his abilities and potential, something that had been sorely lacking in his personal life back in Seattle. The silence from his mother had been deafening at first. No phone calls, no text messages, no emails demanding explanations or attempting guilt-induced manipulation. Marcus had found this absence of communication both relieving and unsettling. Part of him had expected Marcus to launch an immediate campaign to draw him back to Seattle, but the weeks had passed without any direct contact from her. David had called regularly, providing updates on the family situation with the careful neutrality of someone trying to avoid taking sides in an ongoing conflict. Margaret was struggling financially, he'd reported, having to take a part-time job at a local department store to cover expenses that Marcus's salary had previously handled. The house needed repairs that she couldn't afford, and she'd been forced to cancel several subscription services and downgrade her cable package. But David had also shared more troubling information. Margaret had been telling anyone who would listen that Marcus had abandoned her without warning, leaving her destitute and alone. The narrative she'd constructed painted her as the victim of an ungrateful son who'd chosen career advancement over family loyalty. Some relatives had accepted this version of events, while others had asked more probing questions that made Margaret uncomfortable. The most painful revelation had come during a call in late February, when David had reluctantly admitted that Margaret had been bad-mouthing Marcus to his extended family. She'd called his Aunt Patricia to complain about his selfishness, contacted his cousins to share her version of events, and even reached out to family friends to garner sympathy for her situation. But Margaret's campaign had backfired in ways she apparently hadn't anticipated. Several family members had remembered the colonel's visit and his glowing assessment of Marcus's character. Others had recalled their own experiences with Margaret's difficult behavior and had been less sympathetic to
Her complaints than she'd expected. The family dynamics that she'd hoped to manipulate in her favor had instead exposed her own shortcomings. The turning point had come when Margaret had made the mistake of calling Colonel Patterson directly, having somehow obtained his contact information from a relative who'd kept in touch with him over the years. Her intention had apparently been to convince him that his assessment of Marcus had been wrong, that he'd been deceived by a manipulative son who'd been putting on an act during their Christmas meeting. The colonel's response, as reported by David, who'd heard it secondhand, had been swift and devastating. He'd informed Margaret that he'd served with men of all different character types over the course of his military career, and that he was quite capable of recognizing genuine honor when he encountered it. Furthermore, he'd told her that Thomas Chen would have been ashamed to see his daughter-in-law attacking his grandson's reputation out of spite and selfishness. The conversation had ended with Colonel Patterson suggesting that Margaret might benefit from examining her own behavior rather than blaming others for the consequences of her choices. He'd also mentioned that he planned to stay in touch with Marcus, having been impressed by the young man's character, and wanting to honor his friendship with Thomas Chen by maintaining a relationship with his grandson. This public rebuke from such a respected figure had apparently shattered Margaret's confidence in her narrative. According to David, she'd become increasingly isolated and bitter, pushing away even the relatives who'd initially been sympathetic to her situation. Her complaints about Marcus had taken on an increasingly desperate quality, as if she knew that her version of events was losing credibility but couldn't stop herself from continuing to tell it. Meanwhile, Marcus's life in Austin had been flourishing in ways he'd never imagined possible. The work at Meridian continued to challenge and fulfill him, with each successful project building his confidence and a reputation within the company. He'd been invited to speak at a major industry conference about cloud security innovations, an opportunity that would have been unthinkable in his previous position. But it was the personal relationships he'd been building that had truly transformed his daily experience. His neighbors in the converted warehouse building included a mix of young professionals, artists, and entrepreneurs who'd created an informal community around their shared appreciation for the neighborhood's creative energy. Friday evening gatherings on the building's rooftop had become a regular tradition where residents shared food, stories, and connections that felt genuine and unforced. Marcus had also begun dating for the first time in years, no longer constrained by the financial and emotional obligations that had consumed his energy in Seattle. He'd met Rachel Kim through a hiking group that explored the hill country surrounding Austin, and their relationship had developed with a naturalness that felt revolutionary after years of guilt-laden family dynamics. Rachel was a veterinarian who ran her own practice specializing in exotic animals, and her passion for her work matched Marcus's enthusiasm for technology. She was independent without being distant, supportive without being demanding, and genuinely interested in his thoughts and experiences without trying to reshape them to fit her expectations. Their conversations flowed easily across topics ranging from professional challenges to travel dreams to philosophical questions about purpose and fulfillment.
The contrast with his family relationships couldn't have been more stark. With Rachel, Marcus felt appreciated for who he was, rather than criticized for who he wasn't. She celebrated his achievements without minimizing them, supported his goals without redirecting them, and offered perspectives that enhanced his thinking rather than undermining his confidence. Their first major trip together had been to Big Bend National Park.
"You look like you've been sleeping better," Kevin had observed over dinner at one of Austin's famous barbecue restaurants. "And you're talking about your work like you actually enjoy it, rather than just tolerating it. What changed?" Marcus had considered the question carefully, recognizing that the changes went deeper than geography or job description. "I think I stopped trying to live up to other people's definitions of success and started figuring out what success means to me," he'd said. "It turns out that recognition and autonomy matter more to me than security and obligation. Who knew?" Kevin had laughed, but his expression had been thoughtful. "Your mother still doesn't understand why you left?" The question had brought up emotions that Marcus had been working to process throughout his first months in Austin. "I don't think she's capable of understanding it," he'd admitted. "To understand it, she'd have to acknowledge that her behavior was problematic, and that doesn't seem to be something she's willing or able to do. So instead, she's created a narrative where I'm the villain and she's the victim." But even as he'd spoken these words, Marcus had realized that his anger toward his mother had largely dissipated, replaced by something more complex and ultimately more peaceful. He no longer felt the burning resentment that had characterized his final months in Seattle, nor the guilt that had followed him during his early weeks in Austin. Instead, he felt a kind of sad acceptance of who his mother was and what their relationship had become. This emotional evolution had been facilitated by several conversations with Colonel Patterson, who had indeed maintained contact with Marcus after their Christmas meeting. The colonel had called every few weeks, ostensibly to check on Marcus's adjustment to his new city, but actually serving as a kind of informal mentor and connection to his grandfather's legacy. During one particularly meaningful conversation in May, the colonel had shared more details about Thomas Chen's military service, including stories that painted a picture of a man who'd understood the difference between loyalty and enabling. Thomas had apparently been known for his willingness to stand up to superior officers when he believed they were making decisions that would endanger his men, even when such challenges put his own career at risk. "Your grandfather understood that real loyalty sometimes requires saying no," Colonel Patterson had explained. "He knew that blindly following orders or accepting unreasonable demands wasn't honor. It was cowardice. Honor meant standing up for what was right, even when it was difficult or costly." The parallel to Marcus's own situation had been unmistakable, and the colonel's words had provided a framework for understanding his decision to leave Seattle as an act of courage rather than abandonment. Thomas Chen would have understood that enabling his daughter-in-law's dysfunctional behavior wouldn't have helped her grow or change, and that sacrificing his own well-being to maintain an unhealthy dynamic would have been a betrayal of his own principles. These insights had been reinforced during a visit from David and his family over Memorial Day weekend. Marcus had been nervous about hosting his brother, uncertain how their relationship might have been affected by his departure from Seattle and the ongoing family tensions. But the visit had gone better than he'd dared to hope, revealing that distance had actually strengthened rather than weakened their bond. David had been genuinely excited to see Marcus's new apartment and meet Rachel, and his enthusiasm had seemed completely authentic. The children had loved exploring Austin's family-friendly attractions, from the bats emerging from the Congress Avenue Bridge to the interactive exhibits at the Bullock, Texas State History Museum. Jennifer had been relaxed and happy in a way that Marcus hadn't seen during recent visits to Seattle, apparently freed from the tension that had characterized family gatherings in recent years. But it had been David's private conversation.
Marcus, though, had provided the most meaningful connection. Away from their mother's influence and the complicated dynamics of their childhood home, the brothers had been able to talk openly about their family situation for the first time in years. "I've been watching how you've handled this whole situation," David had said during a quiet moment on Marcus's balcony after the children had gone to bed,
At first, I thought maybe you were being too harsh, that you should have tried harder to work things out with Mom. But seeing how much happier you are now and seeing how she's been behaving since you left, I'm starting to understand that you made the right choice. The validation from his brother had meant more to Marcus than any professional recognition or external success. David had witnessed the family dynamics from the inside, had seen both Marcus's years of sacrifice and Margaret's increasingly unreasonable demands. His acknowledgement that leaving had been the right choice had felt like absolution from someone whose opinion truly mattered. David had also shared updates on their mother's situation that had been both troubling and illuminating. Margaret's financial struggles had forced her to make significant lifestyle changes, including selling some of her jewelry and considering whether to downsize to a smaller home. But rather than using these challenges as opportunities for reflection and growth, she'd apparently become increasingly bitter and resentful. Her complaints about Marcus had evolved from accusations of abandonment to more elaborate conspiracy theories about his motivations and character. She'd convinced herself that his move to Austin had been planned for months, possibly years, and that his financial support had been part of some complex manipulation designed to make her dependent on him. The narrative had grown increasingly detached from reality, suggesting that Margaret preferred fantasy to the painful work of honest self-examination. But David had also shared information that had given Marcus hope for healing, if not with his mother, then at least within the broader family structure. Several relatives had reached out to David expressing admiration for Marcus's courage in pursuing his own path, and some had even apologized for initially accepting Margaret's version of events without question. His Aunt Patricia had been particularly supportive, sending a care package to Marcus's Austin address, along with a note expressing pride in his accomplishments and understanding of his difficult choice. His cousin Danielle had connected with him on social media, liking and commenting on his posts about Austin adventures and professional achievements. Even his elderly grandmother, Margaret's mother-in-law, had apparently expressed approval of Marcus's decision to make his own way in the world. These gestures of support had helped Marcus understand that his relationship with his extended family didn't have to be held hostage to his conflict with his mother. He could maintain connections with people who mattered to him without subjecting himself to Margaret's toxic behavior. The family didn't have to choose sides. They could simply acknowledge that some relationships were healthier than others. As summer had approached, Marcus had found himself reflecting on how much his life had changed in just 6 months. The professional success had been gratifying, but the personal growth had been transformative. He'd learned to recognize and prioritize his own needs, to build relationships based on mutual respect rather than obligation, and to define success according to his own values rather than external expectations. The contrast with his previous existence had been remarkable. In Seattle, he'd felt constantly drained by the effort required to manage his mother's emotions and expectations while trying to advance his own career and maintain his own well-being. In Austin, energy flowed toward creative and fulfilling activities rather than being consumed by emotional labor and family drama. Rachel had been an integral part of this transformation.
Not because she'd rescued him from his situation, but because she'd provided a model of what healthy relationships could look like. Her support was offered freely, without expectation of payment or reciprocal sacrifice. Her encouragement came without conditions or attempts at control. Her love felt nourishing rather than depleting. The depth of this relationship had surprised Marcus, who'd assumed that his capacity for intimate connection had been damaged by years of family dysfunction. But building trust with Rachel had been natural and effortless, suggesting that his relationship skills had been intact all along, simply suppressed by circumstances that had rewarded accommodation over authenticity. Their relationship had deepened throughout the spring, moving from casual dating to genuine partnership with a speed that felt both exciting and comfortable. Rachel had begun spending nights at Marcus's apartment, and he'd been given a key to hers. They'd talked about taking a longer trip together, possibly to Europe in the fall, and had begun making plans that assumed their relationship would continue to grow and evolve. But it had been their conversations about the future that had revealed how profoundly Marcus's perspective on life had shifted. For years, his planning had been constrained by obligations and limitations that had seemed immutable. His career choices had been influenced by the need to stay close to Seattle. His financial decisions had been shaped by his mother's requirements. His social life had been limited by the time and energy consumed by family responsibilities. Now, for the first time in his adult life, Marcus was free to make choices based purely on his own desires and goals. The possibilities felt both exhilarating and overwhelming, like standing at the edge of a vast landscape with no predetermined path to follow. The realization that he was truly free had crystallized during a conversation with Rachel about her own dreams and ambitions. She'd been considering expanding her veterinary practice to include a wildlife rehabilitation center, a project that would require significant time and investment but could make a meaningful difference in animal conservation efforts. "What's stopping you?" Marcus had asked, genuinely curious about her hesitation. "Nothing, really," Rachel had admitted with a laugh that contained equal parts excitement and terror. "That's the scary part. I have the resources, the skills, and the opportunity. The only thing holding me back is fear of failure and the comfort of maintaining the status quo." Her words had resonated deeply with Marcus, who'd realized that he was facing a similar crossroads. For the first time in years, his choices were limited only by his own courage and imagination. He could pursue any career path that appealed to him, live anywhere that seemed interesting, build any kind of life that reflected his values and dreams. The freedom was both liberating and daunting, representing possibilities that stretched far beyond the narrow confines of his previous existence. But it also required him to take responsibility for his choices in ways that had been unnecessary when those choices were constrained by family obligations and external limitations. As he'd sat on his balcony that evening, looking out at the Austin skyline while Rachel worked on her laptop beside him, Marcus had felt a profound sense of gratitude for the journey that had brought him to this moment. The path had been painful and uncertain, requiring him to make choices that felt like betrayal, even when they were necessary for his own survival and growth. But the Colonel's words from that fateful Christmas evening had proven prophetic. Honor had indeed pointed toward difficult choices, but following that guidance had led to a life that felt authentic and fulfilling in ways he'd never experienced. His grandfather's compass, now displayed prominently on his desk, continued to point steadily north, a reminder that true direction came from within rather than from the expectations and demands of others. The silence from his mother had continued through the summer, broken only by secondhand reports from David about her ongoing struggles and complaints. But Marcus had found that the absence of her critical voice had allowed him to hear his own thoughts more clearly, to understand his own desires and priorities, without the constant noise of disapproval and manipulation. He also discovered reserves of strength and resilience that had been hidden beneath years of accommodation and people-pleasing. The man who'd sat frozen at that Christmas dinner table, absorbing insults and criticism without protest, had evolved into someone capable of setting boundaries and defending his choices with quiet confidence. The transformation had been noticed by colleagues, friends, and even casual acquaintances who'd remarked on changes in his demeanor and energy. Marcus carried himself differently now, with the posture of someone who knew his own worth and didn't require external validation to maintain his sense of self. But perhaps the most significant change had been in his relationship with himself. The inner critic that had echoed his mother's disappointed voice for so many years had gradually been replaced by a more compassionate and realistic assessment of his strengths and weaknesses. He'd learned to celebrate his achievements without minimizing them, to acknowledge his mistakes without catastrophizing them, and to pursue his goals without requiring permission or approval from others. As autumn had approached, bringing with it the anniversary of his departure from Seattle, Marcus had begun to contemplate how much his life had changed in just 1 year. The professional success had exceeded his wildest expectations. The personal relationships had flourished beyond anything he'd experienced.
and the sense of personal fulfillment had grown with each passing month. But more importantly, he'd learned that he was capable of creating the life he wanted, rather than simply accepting whatever circumstances were imposed on him. The lesson had been hard-won, requiring him to walk away from family relationships that had defined him for decades, and to rebuild his identity from the ground up. The cost had been significant, including the loss of his relationship with his mother and the complicated emotions that came with that choice. But the benefits had been even more substantial, encompassing not just professional advancement and romantic fulfillment, but a fundamental shift in how he understood his own agency and potential. Looking ahead, Marcus could see possibilities that stretched far beyond anything he'd previously imagined. With Rachel, he was building a partnership based on mutual respect and shared dreams. With Meridian Technologies, he was contributing to innovations that could reshape entire industries. With his chosen family of friends and colleagues in Austin, he was part of a community that celebrated, rather than constrained, individual growth and achievement. The compass on his desk continued to point steadily north, just as it had for decades of faithful service to his grandfather. But now Marcus understood that true north wasn't a fixed destination, but rather a constant direction, a commitment to honor and integrity that required ongoing choices and periodic course corrections. The man who'd been called a family failure at a Christmas dinner table had discovered that failure and success were matters of perspective, defined not by others' expectations, but by one's own values and goals. In leaving Seattle, he'd found not just a new city, but a new version of himself, one that honored his grandfather's legacy while creating his own path forward into an uncertain but promising future.
Their revolutionary cloud security platform to representatives from 3 Fortune 500 companies, each considering multi-million-dollar implementations. The irony wasn't lost on him that exactly 1 year ago, he'd been sitting at his mother's dining table being called a family failure. Now he was leading a team of 12 engineers and preparing to pitch technology that could reshape how major corporations approached data security. The transformation felt surreal, as if he were living someone else's life, except that every detail felt authentically his own. Sarah Martinez burst through the conference room door, her laptop bag slung over her shoulder and excitement radiating from every gesture. "The demo environment is perfect," she announced, setting up her computer with practiced efficiency. "All systems are running optimally, and I've triple-checked every integration point. We're as ready as we'll ever be." Marcus nodded, feeling the familiar pre-presentation butterflies that had become associated with career-defining moments, rather than the anxiety-inducing family gatherings he'd once dreaded. This nervous energy felt productive and purposeful, channeled towards something he'd helped create rather than absorbed in managing someone else's emotional volatility. James Thompson followed Sarah into the room, carrying a stack of materials and wearing the confident expression of someone who'd spent years briefing military commanders under far more stressful circumstances. "Security protocols are locked down tight," he reported. "I've verified that all data transmissions will be encrypted and that our backup systems are fully operational. Even if something goes catastrophically wrong, we won't compromise any client information." Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.